Welcome, everybody. Kevin Palau here with the Luis Palau Association, and many of you have been part of a whole series of these gospel gatherings through the blessing of Zoom. And if there was ever a time where we needed this particular conversation, ministry and self-care in an anxious time, sustaining ourselves for the long haul, it's really a blessing to have Father Ron Rolheiser leading us in this time. And just before I open in prayer, a bit about we're going to have two sessions with Father Rolheiser, Father Ron, and John Mark Comer from Bridgetown, and Renjy Abraham, who's both associate pastor at Village Church, but also Dean of Spiritual Life at Multnomah, are going to serve as panelists and just help guide some Q&A with Father Ron after each of the two sessions. So let me open in prayer, and I'll hand it over to John Mark to officially introduce Father Ron. Let's pray together. Father, we do look to you and to the ministry of your Holy Spirit to take your word through Father Ron and through the dialogue that we'll have with John Mark and Renjy and make it nourishment for our souls. We desperately need this. We feel so stretched and pulled in so many directions. The season we're in is truly unprecedented between the pandemic, economic turmoil, and then especially now the call for racial justice and so many of us just beginning to listen and learn. So Lord, our souls are stretched to the breaking point, and we pray you would use Father Ron and this dialogue to nourish us, and we pray your guidance on every word that's said in Christ's name. Amen. Let me hand it over to John Mark to introduce Father Ron.
Thanks, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. You know, we are living through a very hard time, but it is a beautiful day in the Pacific Northwest. And it is my honor to introduce you to Father Ronald Rolheiser. He said to call him Ron, but I just do not feel at all comfortable with that. Father Rolheiser has been a priest since 1972. He's Canadian by birth, but currently and for many years has been the president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. But he's best known as a writer on Christian spirituality. You know, the gift of the book is that people like you and me get to be mentored by leaders who are thousands of miles away or have been dead for hundreds of years, or in my case, just that we could never get access to because they are far out of our league. And Father Rolheiser, we don't know each other, but you have been that for me for so many years. If I had to name just two or three thinkers and followers of Jesus outside of the New Testament who really have given shape to the cartography of my spiritual life, you'd be at the top of that list. We recently stole Ben Sassy's idea of developing a family canon of about 50 books that shape the ethos of your family that you pass down generation to generation. So we're developing ours right now, and we sat down to make our list, like literally at the top of the list, the first one in was Sacred Fire by you. I recently read Frederick Buechner's short little memoir, Telling Secrets, and he was a novelist and a pastor, and he has a couple pages, my favorite part of the book, where he calls pastors to basically function like a novelist and to pay attention to their own life with God in order to help other people that they pastor pay attention to their own life with God. And Father Ron, you have done that so well. Just the way that you put language to the felt experience of the soul and the spiritual journey is just without parallel in my experience. So we're really grateful. For those of you that are new to Father Rolheiser, if you're interested in reading his work, his best known work is The Holy Longing, beautiful book. His most recent work is Domestic Monastery, which you can read in about 45 minutes. And it's all about parenting and spiritual formation. It is gold. I think I bought literally 10 copies at Christmas and gave them to every young parent kind of in my family and little sphere of relationships. It's really good. And then my favorite book of all time by him is Sacred Fire. I read it every single year, at least once. And it's about kind of the mix of developmental psychology and Christian stage theory, and specifically about discipleship in the middle years of your life, kind of that long run from when you kind of settle into adulthood and you have maybe a family or a job or maybe a mortgage or whatever that weight of responsibility is now on you all the way kind of to retirement. And it's just such a gift. And so We're really grateful that you would give us your time. Father Rolheiser, I want to turn it over to you. As Kevin said, the title is Ministry and kind of Soul Care in this time of anxiety. I've been a pastor for 20 years, and the last 3 months have been without parallel, by far the most difficult thing I've ever been through. So I am just waiting on the edge of my seat. I have my notepad open. I'm ready to listen. And for all of you on here, would you just please give, I know we're on mute, but would you give a warm virtual welcome to Father Ronald Rolheiser?
Well, thank you, John. That was a very, very generous introduction, and now I'm humbled by that, and I hope I'm not going to be too disappointing after this. So we want to look today at ministry and self-care in an anxious time, and this is an anxious time. I'm going to share the screen here just briefly for a minute, just to show you what we want to do, and then I'll revert back to the thing. But basically, I want to do with you two things. In the first hour, or the first section, which is not an hour, I want to look at naming the tensions and the tiredness within ministry in our anxious time, and then look at how we're beset from without and beset from within. And I want to take the text from Beset from Hebrews. So you see down there, whoever wrote Hebrews, we used to attribute to Paul. We don't know really who wrote this letter, but it says, every high priest is taken from among men, it's appointed on behalf of men, people, to things pertaining to God in order to offer gifts and sacrifices for his sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the misguided, since he himself or herself is also beset by weakness. I want to really zero on that last night. We are beset by weakness, and therefore we can deal gently with other people. Let's look at that. Being beset from without and within. I want to begin with just two quotes, statements. Richard Rohr, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with, Richard Rohr likes to say that not everything can be fixed or cured, but it should be named properly. It's very important. Not everything can be fixed or cured, but it should be named properly. And I'm convinced today in the churches, well, in society too, there's simply a lot of sloppy naming where people say, well, we live in a postmodern world, or are we? Or this is post-Christian in the West, is it? And so on. So I want to try to name, but the second quote comes from one of my favorite philosophers, James Hillman. And Hillman says, a symptom suffers most when it doesn't know where it belongs. It's a good expression. A symptom suffers the most when it doesn't know where it belongs. So as an example, imagine you have a backache, and then you start thinking all kinds of dark thoughts. This might be bone cancer or whatever. You go and you see a doctor, and the doctor says, this is arthritis. Now, it's not a pleasant diagnosis, but you know what it is, you know? So this morning, I want to, at the first part, I want to do more just some naming of the struggles that beset us. So I want to start, this is my computer giving us this. Give me 30 seconds. I need to shut something down here. Okay. Sorry about that. I hadn't turned off my Microsoft, and every time I was going to get an email, it was going to make a little noise. But being beset from without, I want to name really here 3 major struggles, but then really draw with the third one. And the first one is, and you've been talking about this just in the minutes I've been with you, we live in a very torn, polarized, divided time with a lot of wounds in our society and so on. And so there's a lot of tension out there. There's a lot of resentment from a lot of people. You know, I'm a Canadian, so I haven't lived in the United States other than the last 15 years, but I don't suspect that this country has ever been as divided as right now since the Civil War. You know, like families can't have conversations together at tables and so on. And so we're living in a very, very polarized time in which our communities are torn and fragmented. And as somebody ministering you're right in the middle of this. And you can't help but simply, even if you're a saint, you're going to get very, very tired from just dealing with this all the time. And then we live at a time where, say, we live and love and forgive, where we struggle to do that inside of just the infectious ideologies that afflict us. Our culture, not just our culture, all cultures, we're just beset with ideologies. I often think, when somebody says, "What do you think about this?" I think the honest answer sometimes would be, "I really don't know. I know what I'm supposed to think if I'm in a liberal circle or conservative circle or this kind of circle or that kind of circle, that I'm not sure we ever get to what we call true sincerity." Sincerity comes from two Latin words, "sincere," means without wax. There's no makeup, there's no wax, it's just raw. And it's hard to get there. I'll give you a simple example. 15 years ago, when Mel Gibson came up with this movie called The Passion of the Christ, and liberals, conservatives just lined up against it. The conservatives said, "This is the greatest movie ever done on Jesus." And liberals said, "This is it's a horrible movie," and so on. I was kind of convinced. I'm not sure anybody was really watching the movie. I think liberals and conservatives were watching each other watch the movie and reacting. So we live with kind of infectious ideologies. We inhale them, and that's kind of the social milieu, the existential, we'd say in philosophy, that we live under. But now, I want to spend some time looking at the tensions within our faith, the tensions within religion, the tension within our churches, and I want to try to tease out 4 of them. And these tensions, I want to say, are innate. They're innate, which means they'll always be there, and they always should be there. These are, you have tensions that are artificial or they're provoked, whatever, but there's tensions that are innate. They should always be there, and they always will be there. And the first one I say is the tension between what I call Deuteronomy, prophecy, and wisdom. Deuteronomy, prophecy, wisdom. And this, I want to lean on the work here of Walter Brueggemann, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, but Walter Brueggemann writes, he says, imagine, just take the question, and you can ask yourself this: what is the very essence of religion? Or in our case, what is the very essence of Christianity? What is just beyond the penultimate, the ultimate? What is it? And he said, in Scripture, but you get 3 answers, and you always get 3 answers. For some, he calls it Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, the answer is, the essence of religion is right doctrine and right practice and right morals. That, and we used to define, I remember in Roman Catholicism, what makes a practicing Catholic? That somebody goes to church and keeps the commandments. I'm sure in your own denomination, so on, it's kind of the same thing. What makes for a practicing Christian? Well, somebody who goes to church and obeys the rules, But then you see in early Judaism, the early part of the Old Testament, that became so legalistic that after a while they just had books and books of how you do this. It got right down to how you boil milk. This is if you're a good Jew, this is what you do. And then that held sway, as Brueggemann says, until the great prophets came along. So the great prophets came along and they literally blew this out of the water. So the great prophets came along, they said, something? God doesn't really care how you boil milk, You know what God cares about? The poor. And that's when they brought in that first great social justice motif. And they have there's a mantra in there that's still worth memorizing. So the great prophet said, the quality of your faith will be judged by the quality of justice in the land. And the quality of justice in the land will always be judged by how the weakest in your society, which they called widows, orphans, and strangers. You know, that's code for the weakest members. How are they faring while you're alive? You know, that's quite a switch from religious practice. They're saying, you know, what God cares about are the poor, and you're going to be judged not on your religious practice, but on how you treated the poor when you were alive, particularly the three most vulnerable groups. But Dennis Brueggemann points out the Old Testament doesn't end there. After the prophets come the wisdom figures and wisdom literature, the Psalms as an example, and they come along, they say, you know what's more important than religious practice? And you know what's more important than justice? How you do it. How do you do it? You know, and they say what God wants from you is a mellow, compassionate heart, or a wise, compassionate heart. So they'd say the very essence of religion is to have a wise and compassionate heart, and then you'll do religious practice, and you will do justice, and so on. Now, if you move to the New Testament, to the Gospels, and you look at Jesus with them, you'll see what Jesus does is Jesus actually ratifies all three. So Jesus comes along and he says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So he doesn't at all, you know, bracket religious practice. But then even stronger than the prophets, he comes up with the justice thing. And because if he says, you're going to be judged, you know, we have that scary text in Matthew 25, where Jesus says, and the question is the last judgment. How will you be judged? And Jesus says, well, the judge will come out. There'll be sheep to the right, goats to the left. He's going to divide the people. And there's going to be only one criteria of questions. Did you feed the hungry? Give drink to the thirsty? Clothe the naked? Visit prisoners? And you say, well, what about church practice? And what about the commandments? And what about the sixth commandment? And so on. But it doesn't appear there. Just all this, you know. I sometimes tell seminarians when I'm teaching them, I said, if you would go into a church on Sunday and preach that, you know, just say, you're going to be judged by how you treat the poor. That's it. You would be in some ecclesial office the next day. If you're Roman Catholic, you'd be in the bishop's office, and so on. And so one seminarian said, well, how did Jesus get away with that? I said, he didn't. He wasn't called to the bishop's office. They crucified him, you know. But Jesus is stronger. In fact, and he goes one step further than the prophets. Remember, the prophet said, God favors the poor. Jesus went further. Jesus says, God is in the poor. The way you treat the poor, that's the way you're treating God. But then Jesus comes along too, and he says, however, you know what God really wants? You know, be compassionate the way your heavenly Father is compassionate. That so that in effect, in the New Testament and in the Jewish scriptures, you get religion calls you to right practice, it calls you to the right message for the poor, and it calls you to the right energy. Except, now that's the tension I want to point out, invariably it's true in both testaments of Scripture, and it's true in every one of our churches today, you have three kinds of people. You have Deuteronomy people who are all about practice and so on. You have social justice people who are all about justice. And then you still have the people going off on retreats, you know, and doing centering prayer and, you know, mindfulness and so on. And all of that is good, except this is the issue. Usually they don't get along all that well. And usually it's not the same person doing all three. You know, Jesus could do all three. Or if I can use a Roman Catholic example, Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day could lead the pious prayer circle, and she could lead the peace march, you know, and she could teach you how to pray. You know, today it usually takes three separate people. So I have a pretty wide experience now with various churches, and sometimes it shakes out more in the liberal conservative thing, but it's more accurately, people dig in three ways, you know, right practice, social justice, right energy. And so you'll always be dealing with that tension. That's an innate tension, okay? Because it comes right from the heart of the message itself. Then the second tension, you know, and incidentally, you've all got a copy now of these notes. So if you check your email, you can lay these notes in front of you. the tension between what I call the Son of God and Adonai. I want to tease out a scripture text for you here, you know. Now, I forget now whether I did this in Sacred Fire or not. You know, if I did, then forgive me the repetition. But it's a wonderful text. It's in Mark's Gospel. It's also in Matthew's Gospel, of Jesus' dialogue with the Syrophoenician woman. And incidentally, for those of you who preach, that is a homilist delight. It's a text you want to order from the catalog because you can sound really brilliant because the text is so rich and layered, you know. And it's this. Let me run the incident and then we'll. So they say one day Jesus was walking along the borders of Samaria, okay, when he met a woman, okay, and the woman happened to be a Syrophoenician. And she says to him, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me and cure my daughter who's very sick. And Jesus says to her, in one of the more curious lines you're going to get in the New Testament, Jesus says, no. He said, it's not fair to take the bread of the children and give it to the house dogs. Isn't that a wonderful pastoral line? Someone come up to you, say, can you help? You say, no, I don't work with dogs. I only work with my own denomination. Okay. But then she says, ah, yes, Lord Adonai. Notice she changes the designation. She said, Jesus, son of David. Now she says, yes, Lord Adonai. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And then Jesus does a 180-degree turn. He says, you know, wow. He said, in all of Israel, I never saw faith like yours. And he gives her the miracle. Now, what happened there? Start from the beginning. It's a carefully worded text. One day, Jesus was walking along the borders of Samaria. You know, in the Gospels, oftentimes geography is really, really important theologically. It's not just a designation, you know. Borders means what? Borders means edges. He was walking along the edges of what? Okay. Well, Samaria. Samaria was a different religion. Okay. Samaria was a different ethnicity, and he's going to meet a woman who's a different gender. You know, someone said today, where is the Christian church standing today? I could say very simply, we're standing on new borders of ethnicity, religion, and gender. And if you know the news for the last 50 years hasn't woken us up, you know, we won't wake up, you know. We're on new borders of ethnicity, religion, gender, okay. Now, the woman's a Syrophoenician, that's not important. What's important so much, I mean, specifically, it's important that she's not a Jew, okay. And so she comes up to Jesus and she says, Jesus, son of David. She's calling him by his Jewish title, you know, the Jewish Messiah. She comes up, she's literally saying, are you the Jewish Messiah? She says, I'd like to get a miracle. And then Jesus says, no, I only work, I'm designated for the children of Israel. I only work with my own denomination. Incidentally, that's, I've been called only to the lost sheep of Israel. That was a tension that perdured through the New Testament in terms of Paul and Peter, and do we go to the Gentiles or not? Who are we called to? Okay. And he says, no, I won't do it for you. And then she's a pretty resilient woman. Okay. You know, people sometimes praise her persistence, but it's not so much the persistence, it's her resiliency and her quick change. So it says, ah, yes, Lord Adonai. Notice she calls him by a completely different title. Adonai is the universal word for God, the universal for God. Now let's play this out. Imagine this. In one of your religious community, your parishes or whatever you call them, your Sunday community, imagine you're doing a baptismal program and you have a group, you have 10 or 15 people, and you work with them over some months. You know, you work with them for some months, and now you're going to have a Sunday, you're going to have a beautiful baptism. The people are there, there's water in the baptistry, and you're all, you know, everybody's excited. And as these people are lined up, a woman comes in whom you've never seen, and she comes up to you and says, you know, do you do the baptismal stuff here? And you say, yeah. She said, I'd like to be baptized. What do you think her chances are? Well, you'd probably answer like Jesus. You'd say, no, no, it's not fair to these people. They just did 8 weeks of preparation. Jesus telling the woman, I'm the Jewish Messiah. The Jews just did about 800 years of sacramental preparation here. You can't just jump in the line. But now back to you and the woman. She said, sorry, I obviously misaddressed you. You're not just the minister here or the priest or the person in charge of baptism. Are you also a universal instrument for salvation for all people on this planet? Adonai. Are you also a universal instrument for all people on this planet? And then if you were honest, you'd say, yes, I am. He said, well, then I'm one of yours. I'm one of yours. And then if you were like Jesus, you'd say, wow, you skipped all the training, but you're more ready than anybody who's taken the training. Get in line, I'll baptize you first. Now, well, first, a note about the dog, a little footnote. Scholars look at that about it's not fair to take the children's bread and give it to the house dogs. They say what's behind that is two things. First of all, they suggested was banter. See, sometimes when it seems Jesus and this woman are having a very robust conversation. Sometimes you're dealing with people, they're so fragile, and you can't touch them, you got to be very gentle. Sometimes during a conversation, it's robust. You can really kind of give it to each other. So they say, you get the sense that Jesus and this woman had this very robust conversation, but, he nails her, but she also nails him. When he says, it's not fair to take the bread of the children and give it to the house dogs, she's in fact saying, yes, if you're a Jew and you're an idiot, yes. See, because the Jews and Gentiles had different customs. In a Jewish house, a dog never went in the house. In the Gentiles, they did. The dogs were under the table. So if you wanted to slip a dog a crumb, you just put your hand down, he's right there. Now, that's the banter part. The deeper part is this. There's a deep, important part to this that ties to this Adonai. Jesus is in effect saying to her, as a Jewish Messiah, I got to step out of the Jewish house to feed you. And she's saying, no, I'm already in your house. That's a powerful text we need to really look at denominationally. Who, as a Roman Catholic priest, I have to step out of Roman Catholicism to tend to some other Christian or Jew or Muslim. Say, no, if you're a universal instrument of salvation, they're already in your house. Everybody's in your house. Now, I bring up this text for this reason, not so much how programmatic or non-programmatic it should be in your ministry. This is an innate tension, each of you to this point. Each of you, you are in one way a son or daughter of David. You belong to your denomination. Many of you have been ordained in that denomination. You have your rules. You're tending to those particular communities. You're a son or daughter of David, but you're not just that. You're also Adonai, which means you are a universal instrument of salvation for everybody. And that's a tension. It was a tension in Jesus. It was a tension in the early church. It's still a tension today. Oftentimes, if I could be simplistic here, these things shake out liberal conservative. So often if I'm a conservative, I tend to be a son of David. This is Roman Catholicism. This is who I am, so on. These are the rules. If I'm a liberal, I tend to say, bracket all church rules, but it's both. It's really meant to be a tension. For the first, if I can be personal here, the first almost 16 years of my priesthood, I taught at the seminary in Edmonton, Alberta, and at the time we had a wonderful archbishop. They don't make them like that anymore. And he used to teach that to us both in practice and in theory. And sometimes I'd phone him with a very tricky pastoral problem, and he'd always say, Father, don't ask me about that. He says, you know the rules of the church, you know canon law, you know what should be done, but also you're standing there, you're looking at these people's pain, you're seeing the blood that's there, you have to bring them together, you have to make a decision. Tell me afterwards. If I disagree, I'll tell you afterwards. Or oftentimes you tell the the clergy would say, you're not ecclesial robots. It's a good expression. He said, you're not ecclesial robots. He said, I want you to be loyal to the church, but I want you to be creative. Basically, he didn't have the terminology. He said, I need you to be Adonai. And so that's an innate tension. And again, inside of our ministry and inside of the people we're going to meet inside of ministry, we're going to have that. Then the next one I call the tension between the kenotic and the triumphant Christ. The tension between the kenotic and the triumphant Christ. Now, kenotic, I take the word from the word kenosis in Hebrew, in the Hebrew, and the letter to the Philippians. That great Christological hymn where St. Paul says about Jesus, though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not count equality with God something to be grasped at, but he emptied himself, became a human being and empties himself further and became a slave. Kenosis. He went into emptiness. Now, a couple of stories. Some years ago, when I was still working in our general council in Rome, I organized a number of workshops in different countries, United States, Canada, England, where we called it Missionaries to Secularity. Like, how do we become missionaries inside of highly secularized cultures? And I had one of these at the University of Ottawa. And one of the speakers we had was a French-Canadian woman called Vivian Labrie. And she was more of a social worker, not a theologian, but she has a great reputation on the streets of Quebec, as this great social worker. And she's a Christian. When she spoke, she kind of stunned the audience at a point. She said, I'm a Christian. She said, and what I'm doing in terms of working on the streets for justice, she said, I'm doing for Jesus. I am doing that for Christ. But she said, I can go 3 years on the streets and never mention Jesus' name. And she added this line, she says, because I think Jesus is mature enough that he doesn't always demand to be the center of our conscious attention. She said, I believe in a kenotic Christ. It says, I work for Jesus, I don't have to mention his name all the time. Well, about a month later, I was at our general chapter in Rome, and the oblates whom I belong to, we're like in 70 countries. And when we have a general chapter, it's like United Nations meeting. And it's also a meeting of ecclesiologies from all over. But anyway, we were trying to write a document. And we were trying to write a document from scratch. What do we want to say to the world, not what some experts tell us to say? So we have about 2 or 3 days where people just give input. So the first person who stood up was our provincial from Ireland. He stood up, sharp man, and he says, I live in Dublin, which is the epicenter of the sexual abuse crisis. He said, as a Roman Catholic priest, he said, I keep my head down where it belongs. He says, the only Christ I can preach in Dublin right now is the kenotic Christ. Well, he hadn't sat down and 5 people had microphones from Poland, from different places, say, no, now we have to be out there with, like John Paul with colorful spandex and World Youth Days, and we got to just proclaim the Christ and so on. Somebody even quoted Karl Barth, who said, you have to announce Christ and never be apologetic. So I'll ask you this question, who is right? They are both right. They are both right. The Christ we proclaim is the Christ of kenosis, the Christ who can just disappear. And the Christ we proclaim is also the triumphant Christ of the resurrection. And that's a tension. It's a tension in our lives. It's a tension inside of the church, tension inside of our message. If I can use the Roman Catholic example, and I'm far enough, I'm safe, But for instance, when I preach to Roman Catholic clergy today, not on Zoom, but live, oftentimes they're sitting in 2 groups. You have the Vatican II group. Those are people my age and a little bit younger, See, they're much more the kenotic. They're not wearing their Roman collars, and then you have the younger priests. They're wearing their collars and their soutanes. They're, they're very, we have to be triumphant and be out there and show religious symbols. And they're both right. That's a tension. That's a tension we need to handle. Okay, I'm going to switch now from being beset from without to being beset from within. So we live in those tensions. but we have our own tensions. I said, coping with our own tiredness, our wounds, our depressions, and our inflations. You know, none of us is God. And because we aren't God, we are we're going to always have our inadequacies, our limits, and we're going to get tired. Our wounds are going to show through, our temperament's going to show through. And so we're ministering in goodwill, but we're ministering out of perennial tiredness. We're also ministering out of our wounds. You know, none of us come to adulthood, none of us come to ministry without carrying deep wounds. If you ever read the book by Ellis Miller, that wonderful book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, and Ellis Miller would say, when you get into your 30s, you know, it's not a question of are you wounded, it's only a question of what are your wounds. None of us come from perfect homes. None of us was valued perfectly and always loved perfectly. And many of us have suffered positive abuse, neglect, and we carry those wounds with us and we minister out of those wounds. The second R, I'm going to say that's precisely we have to make those wounds work for us. That, you know, part of the specialness that each of us can bring to ministry is from our woundedness. You know, if you look in your own life, why you were called, why did God call you to ministry and to the vocation you are? And a lot of times, a big part is because of your wounds, you can bring something really special there. Then secondly, our temperament. You know, that isn't often talked about in spirituality, but it's very, very important, our temperament. Let me just use some examples. You know, I look at great figures, you know, heroic figures, you know, say a Martin Luther King, a Gandhi, you know, even a Thomas Merton or a Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, some great prophetic figures and so on. And I envy them. You know, I envy them because I don't have their temperament. And because I don't have their temperament, I don't have their strength. You know, let me just quote you two lines. You know, one of my favorite authors, very deep woman, Ruth Burroughs, who's a British Carmelite, now in her 90s. And I remember being in a bookstore once and just picking up one of her books by, you know, browsing and reading the first line. And I said, the first line in her book, I thought, I want to read this book. This is the first line in her book, her autobiography. She says, I was born with a tortured sensitivity, and it's made my life particularly difficult. Notice she didn't say I was born serenely and all this stuff. She said I was born with a tortured sensitivity. And you know, many of us who are called to ministry, you know something? You were born with a pretty extraordinary sensitivity. Maybe not a tortured one, but it makes it difficult for us to be the Gandhi. You know, I was praying some years ago with that text on John the Baptist, you know, great prophet. And they said, John grew and he grew strong in spirit, you know. And I looked at my own life and I thought, as I grew as a kid, you know, with my own sensitivities, you know, with the public school I went to, the ruggedness of a playground and all the experiences and so on, dealing with some really strong siblings in my family, I said, I grew with an accommodating spirit. See, he grew with a strong spirit. I grew with an accommodating spirit. You know, many people called to ministry, and I've taught in seminaries for years, many of us, you're gentle, good, sensitive, wonderfully sensitive people. But, you know, because of that sometimes prophecy, the hardness is what's difficult for us, not the softness. You know, there are people who find it hard to be vulnerable, find it hard to be gentle and so on. I find that for many people in ministry, it's the opposite. You find it hard to be prophetic, hard to put this hard edge out and so on. You're not like John the Baptist, you've grown gentle and accommodating, not weak. It's not weakness, you know, because our culture sometimes like that. It's accommodating. And in fact, it's a wonderful quality for empathy, for ministry, and so on, but it has its own downside. Okay. Then I want to just mention two more before then we'll break in about 5 minutes for the question period. Also, it doesn't matter, you know, for instance, I'm a Roman Catholic and I'm celibate. Many of you are married and have families and so on. It doesn't matter in this sense. In ministry, you're also going to experience some fierce loneliness. You know, that family can help accommodate, but there's a loneliness in the ministry. You know, René Girard, the great French anthropologist, he coined an expression about Jesus that I liked. You know, I like the expression. He coined the expression, he said, Jesus was, and I want to get this pronounced right, he said, unanimity minus one. Unanimity minus one. You know, that's about as lonely as you can get. There's the whole world, and then you're just you know. Or that great metaphor that Luke has in his gospel, when Jesus is in the garden and he's praying, and Luke says, he was a stone's throw from everyone. Well, how far can you throw a stone? You know, I learned what that expression means, not from scripture, but once visiting a young man dying of cancer in a cancer ward. He was 56. And he said, Father, he says, you know, he said, I have a wonderful wife, wonderful kids, and they hold my hand every minute. He said, but when you die, you're dying alone. He said, I'm a stone's throw from everyone. Now, it's pretty radical when you're dying, but all of us in ministry, and you know the moments, there's going to be moments where you're literally a stone's throw from everyone. You are unanimity minus one. And then finally, be set from within. We're all, no matter who you are, in fact, the more sensitive you are, the more you're going to struggle with this. And that is our fluctuation between depression and inflation. Our fluctuation between depression and inflation. I want to risk saying this. I want to use a bad word, okay? I want to use a bad word, but I'm going to apologize about the word to Christian when it comes out, but it's the most accurate word. But I was once at a conference, and well, I'll mention the name. It was Robert L. Moore, who sadly ended up suicidal of depression. So, but one of really the great men I've met, you know. And he was giving a conference to, as today, it was people in healing ministries, ministers, priests, and so on. And he said, if you're, he began his talk this way. He said, if you're here tonight, he said, you probably live with a certain amount of chronic depression. He said, not clinical depression, chronic depression. He said, because most sensitive people live with a certain chronic depression. And he said, that's good, that's good. And here comes the bad word. He said, because most people who aren't enough sensitive to depression, he said, are assholes. And he said, sorry about the word. He said, most sensitive people are so afraid of being that we sit on a lot of our energies and we don't act them out. We're afraid of ego. And he said, so that we end up being depressed a lot. And then sometimes when we let go, we end up being inflated. And he says the task, and I love this coinage, he said the task, he said, is never to be full of yourself, but never to be empty of God. And that's hard. That's a chronic struggle for somebody who's sensitive. You know, it's not a chronic struggle if you're on the other side. You're always too full of yourself and so on. But he says to be not full of yourself, inflation, and not to be empty of God, not to be empty of this great energy. You know, and when you look at great people, the Gandhis, the Martin Luther Kings, you know, the Mother Teresa's, they notice they were never depressed. And they never apologized for their light. But they were never inflated. You know, rock stars and so on, some athletes and so on, they bring a great energy. It's real energy. It's godly energy, but oftentimes they're identified with it. There's an inflation there, you know. So as a minister, or just as a sensitive woman or man, we're always going to be dealing with this tension instead of us. And that's a healthy tension. It's an innate tension. You know, I may not be full of myself. I may not be empty of God. Depression, inflation, depression, inflation. Okay, I've gone on here now for the 45 minutes and so on. So I'm going to turn it back to Mark and Renjy. Is that the way you say your name?
It's Renjy.
Renjy.
Father Ron.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Father Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through and name the tensions that are at play in our ministry and our lives. Specifically, as you see what's happening in our world with the racial unrest that is national and then local in the cities, and how people are wrestling with that, specifically with the churches. I think when I'm listening to my brothers and sisters from the Black community, I think they're calling out the fact that the church hasn't been able to live in the tension well, to take the spiritual formation and the practice of social action. Is there, as you perceive this, as you look at what's going on, is there a time where we need to emphasize one over the other because of a misguided emphasis in one area?
Yes. No. Thanks, Renjy. A moment calls for its own special grace, and see. So if I can address this now, the moment we're in right now, since we recognized the moment with the death of George Floyd, you know, that calls for special action. And see, this is not a time that we should call for caution, you know. See, and also, you know, in one of the reasons is in our preaching, I don't think a lot of Christians are still accepting that social justice is a non-negotiable part of the Christian life. You know, that they think it's an extra you can do or not do, you know. But I hope I didn't come on too bland in this first hour, you know, because I'm talking about the tensions that we as ministers and so on have to face, you know, with, I'll give you an example right from our school. Right now, we are writing a statement from the school on this, but you know, we have the statement about that Black Lives Matter, but we want to add in just one line about that we shouldn't be using religious symbols, you know, about the presidential march across there to the church and so on. But we know if we do this, we're going to lose a bunch of donors. You know, we just know it. You know, so we have to, you know, do we do this on principle? We're going to upset some of our own donors, because I know one of our donors already saw it in a letter that our provincial released in Washington. Said if you put that in, he said the scholarships I'm offering the school are over and so on. See, so that, but I know that all of you face similar issues. You know, like we don't have homogeneous, but I agree. Now is a time I think we have to risk. We have to risk, and we have to risk misunderstanding. We have to risk being accused of being one-sided with the gospel. You know, this isn't an ordinary time.
Father Rolheiser, I'd love to just have you keep riffing on that. You know, you mentioned early on in your talk some of the, you know, ideologies that I think you used the word inflict our soul, you know, and we really live in an age of ideology. And you've written in some of your books before, in Sacred Fire, and I think more recently in Walking with God, about how it's almost impossible to get involved with social justice without getting your hands a little bit dirty, because it's always connected to socio-political agendas that often might be very crosswise with the way of Jesus. And I think that's a real struggle for so many of us who are Orthodox, historic followers of Jesus, who care deeply about racial justice in particular and social justice. But how do we engage if we're not a postmodern Marxist, for example, you know? And because the conversation is often dominated by leftist ideologies, it can make it really tricky, where it's like, you know what I mean? Like, we have such a deep heart for racial justice, but yet it feels like entering an ideological quagmire. Anything you want to speak to that? How do we enter into this conversation and do justice in the public sphere at all sorts of different levels? And what warnings or wisdom do you have for how we interact with the ideologies of our age?
Well, thanks, Mark. That's John, Mark. That's a that's a tough question. It's a good question in terms of, well, I'll use the perfect example of the streets right now. So we do march for Black Lives Matter, but if you have 10 people smashing windows, then it seems to compromise the whole thing, but you'll always have, whether you're the right or the left, you're always going to have your extreme factions that in a certain sense potentially compromise your witness because you're going to be identified with them, and in fact, I believe that paralyzes a lot of good people.
Yes.
It's paralyzed me many times. See, like if I go there, and especially around issues like abortion or now Black Lives Matter and so on. What's happened? What I call, I said we become infected by the ideologies. Where you get the virus, it gets inside of you. But what's happened politically and also in our churches, and that is that the extremes have kind of intimidated the center. So let's take the United States politically. Right now, the extreme liberals and the extreme conservatives have so much polarized the discussion on everything that it's almost impossible for us to even govern now. But it's also true in the churches. That's why some churches are splitting and so on. And it leaves people in the middle really in a quagmire. If you side with this side or you march with that side, are you marching with their whole agenda? I know some people in the last election, a lot of Christians who didn't vote. They said, I just couldn't vote for either candidate, well, that's not the answer either. Well, I'll bring in one other thing here too, with John Mark, and that is also, and I touched on this first hour, it's also your individual call. Jesus doesn't call us all to act in the same way. There are people who are called to walk politically more, on a stage, that precisely the Gandhis and Martin Luther Kings and the Dorothy Days. There are other people who are called to be contemplative and to pray and support and and maybe that's a rationalization on my part. I don't know, but God doesn't call everybody on conveyor belts. That you do this. Like you have to also respect your temperament as to what you can do and what you're called to do. And now, with that being said, we're always called to stretch ourselves. That we know. The gospel is always calling you to stretch yourself, and maybe it's calling me to go out on a march right now.
Do you have any? That's really helpful and freeing. I only wish most of my church agreed with you on that one. Any advice, and Renjy, jump in here, but on what do you think the role of a pastor is in this time? One of the great areas of debate and disagreement in church history, as I understand it, is about the role of the church toward the larger public sphere at a political level, and obviously the New Testament was written from the perspective of a persecuted minority under an empire. So it doesn't say a lot about how we engage in a democratic process or whatever. And of course you have the Roman Catholic and the Anglican and the Presbyterian veins of the church that have been very involved in politics. And then you have the Anabaptists and Quaker and non-denominational and other, contemplative traditions that have been far more, no, let's create an alternative society that, influences from the margins, but we don't do that. And, there's a genuine disagreement down through church history, but that's really tricky right now. Any thoughts on what is the role and the responsibility that, regardless of our individual call and our individual temperament and all of that, that we just, as a pastor in a modern democracy, what level of responsibility, how do you and I'm not asking for truth, because I know there's disagreement here. I'm just asking for your opinion. what do you think somebody like me is responsible before God and to my community to lead into in this time?
Well, I want to start backwards with your question, John Mark. One of them is just like the difference, like the Quakers answered one way and these another way and so on. You said, those are different answers. No, I think they are different vocational responses. I think all of those are needed. It's not like, do I become a Quaker or do I become some people need to be Quakers and some people need to march and so on. But now to get to your question, what are you called to? You're not going to like the answer. You're called to be crucified. Yeah, remember Jesus said, you're called to be crucified, but it doesn't necessarily mean even there's many forms of crucifixion. Let me try to hone in on that. We always know, remember Jesus said, if you follow me, you're going to suffer, and you're not going to suffer because God's going to lay extra punishment on you. You're going to suffer because precisely the more you open yourself up to God, to Christ, the more pain is going to flow into your life because you're going to be more sensitive to it, But see, you're going to suffer, and you can suffer in different ways. One of them is precisely that you become really active and you get a lot of people who hate you for it, But there's another way, maybe for pastors, and that is, as a pastor, remember, you are in charge of, I hate the expression sheep, but you're in charge of community. You got to keep your family together. So you have to be a community builder inside of this, so that you can't abdicate this role so that, and all those sheep are your sheep, and that's going to stretch you. There's going to be some internal crucifixions as you have to swallow hard, but, we, as a leader, you remember Christ's great prayer of unity in John chapter 17. I pray that they may be one, that they may be one. So, but let me give you one concrete thing, and I get this from Jim Wallace. I think he writes eloquently on justice. But Jim Wallace says one thing: with justice, challenge yourself and challenge your people that they may never bracket fundamental charity. That's what's happening in our churches and our society today. We're becoming uncivil in the name of Christ. We're becoming uncivil in the name of truth, and that's wrong. That's not energy that comes from God's Spirit. So no matter what, no matter how passionate, no matter how much anger, injustice, we always have to be charitable. That we never, and not just charitable, it goes with like kind of a certain respect and a certain charity, that can be hard for us, One of we have a lot of remarkable people. One of the women on our faculty, she said, I watched the news at night. She said, and I go to pray and I ask myself, what does it mean to love in this situation? I think when you go to pray as a pastor, you say, what does it mean to love? What does it mean to pastor? What does it mean to be charitable in this situation? And so that's not a prefab answer. And give you a line from Michael Buckley, who was one of my great mentors in life. He taught me on mysticism. Michael Buckley used to say, when prayer feels the most helpless and the most hopeless, that's when it's the most important. When prayer feels the most helpless and the most hopeless, it's what is my little prayer going to do? That's when it's the most important. So see, Mark, so my answer is you have to go to your prayer and say, what does it mean to love? What does it mean to be a pastor in this situation?
Father Ron, I loved how you answered that, and I think maybe even playing off of that a little bit more. As you discern, as a pastor, as you discern how to keep unity, oneness, harmony within our body, at the same time, it's time to take risks, like you said, and it's time to, there are times where we might make decisions as leaders, as we're guiding and being true to the gospel, where we might lose donors or we might lose members within our community. What guiding principles allow you to discern when to conserve your energy with some people who either decide to step away because of the direction that you're taking? And maybe is it, you mentioned Jesus was on the borders, and I loved that imagery. Is that one of the principles, centering those on the margins? Would you speak to that?
Okay, good question. And you asked for principles, and that's all I can give you, because, let me give a couple of principles. One of them is always the principle of risk. The great poet Goethe used to say that the dangers of life are many, and safety is one of the dangers. There's a danger and risk, but there's a danger in safety. But this is my own way of asking this to myself sometimes, and I want to give you this as a principle to say, is this cross worth dying on? Sometimes you have to look at it, just ask yourself, like, we're asked to die on the cross, but sometimes you have to say, is this particular cross worth dying on? Or is it going to be counterproductive or whatever, sometimes use that principle in my own life, as a writer. Am I going to weigh in on this thing? And then you weigh it out and say, well, very concretely, see, if I say certain things, I write for 70 newspapers. If 30 newspapers drop me the next week, what's this worth it? And I know it's a practical question, so you have to ask yourself, is this cross worth dying on? And some have to say yes, some say, it's worth losing a donor. Some might say, no, it's not worth losing a donor and two people might not answer it the same way, or you may not answer it the same way at different times of your life. The way you answer it this year might not be the way you answer it next year or 10 years from now, But, maybe the question's worded frivolously, but I think you get it. Is this cross worth dying on? But then always pushing yourself with risk, because our natural default is towards safety. And so to push ourselves gospel-wise and human-wise, it's always, I will say, the dangers of life are many, and safety is one of those dangers.
Wow, that's so well said. Kind of connected to that, one of the things that I think we as pastors deal with all the time in a pre-COVID world as well is just so many people have so many different expectations on us, and we're not God, and there's no way we can fulfill them all. And the pastoral call is wide enough and has enough, space for diversity. There are all sorts of different types of men and women in those roles. And so in a pre-COVID world, some people expect you to be the CEO, others of you the spiritual director, others the therapist, others the community organizer, others the kind of like life of the party. Everybody has these different expectations that they bring from their prior church experience, from their own, cultural background, ethnic background, from their own personality, from their own woundedness, or family of origin, and they project all of that onto you. And then now in the COVID and moment that we're in, it's just like off the charts. Now there are a ton of political expectations on us. I literally have people mad at me right now that our church hasn't stopped police brutality. It just feels a little bit outside of my expertise and purview, I think, but people are hurting. And so managing expectations is really hard for me. And I know some of this is my own personality and shadow side and my own stuff. But, when I either don't fulfill somebody's expectation or I can't fulfill somebody's expectation, it's outside of my time or my limits or my call or my theological paradigm. And then people are mad at me. I feel like a bad person, because I haven't done it all or fulfilled this thing. How do you deal at an internal, spiritual, and emotional level with people's expectations on you that either you can't meet or maybe even feel that you should not meet, but yet are still very much there, and people judge you based on your lack of ability or willingness to meet those expectations? And I'm not talking about illegitimate expectations, like that you be godly or kind or faithful to your spouse, but the more broad ones that are either you disagree with or are just beyond your capacity. Yeah.
Well, again, John Mark, I'm going to give you a principle. I think you got to walk between two extremes. One of them is, insensitivity, where you just, you can be callous and say, "To hell with you. I'm going to do what I am. This is what I can do," and so on. See, and then there's oversensitivity, where, you know, you're beating yourself up. You know, Henry Nouwen used to say, I go to bed every night thinking of what I didn't get done. Should have made one more phone call, should have seen this person in the hospital, should have seen this, you know. See, so that we have to walk the line between just, you know, hardening ourselves and just saying like, these are unrealistic, I can't do it, you know, and at the same time, just like try to get into neurosis where you're just constantly beating yourself up. And so, you know, somebody once gave me a banner when I was a young priest, and it's kind of a clever little sound bite. On the banner was simply written, "Fear not, you are inadequate." It's a good banner, you know, like, and yet at the same time we have to, and I'm going to talk about that in the next hour, the tension between healthy self-sacrifice and healthy self-care. You know, like, we have to let ourselves be killed. And, you know, Jesus died at 33, you know, should have been more careful. And yet at the same time, there has to be healthy self-care, because this is a marathon. You're doing this for 40 and 50 and 60 years, and you can't run a marathon like a sprint. And, but I would just leave you, John Mark, with that principle between, and maybe as a sensitive person, maybe some spiritual director or some outside person can help you, because sensitive people sometimes can't stop beating themselves up. You know, sometimes you simply can't not, you know, put extra guilt on yourself, or somebody else will say, John Mark, that's impossible. You can't do it. You can't do it. Go to bed, you know, go on a vacation, and, you know, hit the reset button.
Yeah. Yeah, what a gift. I mean, I love that you answered that question without a solution, but with the reality, naming the tension. And that feels like the major theme from this first talk is a lot of this stuff, there isn't a like, oh, do these 3 things and you will be free of people's expectations and happy all of the time, you know, but it's more about how do we live in that tension. And I very much am to a T that tortured sensitivity. I just ordered a book on the highly sensitive person. So I mean, that's just about the world I live in. And at times I just feel like I should quit my job and go do something else, you know, but so this is beyond helpful. Renjy, anything you want to say, or should we kick into the next season, or what do you think, man?
Yeah, let's, Father Ron, thank you so much. Let's kick into the next.
Can I just say one last thing to John, Mark, on the oversensitivity? You know, a philosopher once pointed out to me in a philosophy class, they said, your greatest strength is your greatest weakness, you know, under a different aspect. So for instance, if you're wonderfully sensitive, that's going to be a great gift for ministry. And it's also going to be your greatest weakness at the same time, you know, and vice versa. People, you know, the brighter your sun, the deeper the shadow, you know, but then look at the gift side of that and say, you know, that, you know, you're going to be a gifted, sensitive minister, you know, who can minister to people's souls, and sometimes it's going to drive you nuts, you know, and that's the crucifixion, you know. It's not just crosses on Calvary you have to die on.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think if I had to pull one line away so far, it would be you're called to be crucified, which is the last thing I want to hear, but it's truth and I receive it. All right, why don't you take us into session 2 and we'll come back. Those of you listening, if you have any more questions, feel free just to sit it in the chat line, and Renjy and I will do our best to pass it on to Father Rolheiser.
Okay, the second hour, I want to talk about ministering beyond our tiredness, our wounds, and our temperament, you know. And I first want to begin simply by naming the tension. And I just named it with John Mark in terms of the discussion we just had. And that is the tension between healthy self-sacrifice and healthy self-care. Like I said, you know, let's look at healthy self-sacrifice. You know, if you just take the Gospels, you just take Jesus, you're not getting a lot of stuff on self-care. So the Gospels lay out the self-sacrifice, you know, just do this, and if you die at 33, you die within 3 years of your ministry, you just do it. And that's oftentimes the example we get from the great saints, you know, young missionaries who went to China and got tortured and died and so on. And those are inspirational stories, but how do you sustain a ministry for 40 and 50 and 60 years, you know? So that today there's a healthy thing in our seminaries and so on that talk about healthy self-care. So that, I'll give you an example from my own life. I went to the seminary in 1966. It was still in a former time. And there, almost the entire emphasis in our seminary studies and spirituality was on self-sacrifice. Give yourself over, your own needs don't mean anything, and so on. It's the Jesus thing. You know, I've taught in seminaries for a long time. Today, sometimes I worry that young men are ordained as Roman Catholic, and they're more into self-care than into self-sacrifice, where they're just taught you got to take care of yourself. You have to take so many days off each week. You have to do this. You have to take these proper vacations. You know, well, it's in between the two. And again, it's meant to be a tension. It's not. I'm into self-sacrifice and not into self-care. I'm into self-care, not into self-sacrifice. It's meant to be a tension. That always, am I being too hard on myself? Am I being too easy on myself? Am I being too hard on myself? Am I being too easy on myself? And most spiritual writers would suggest that we should have a spiritual director or a friend or some counselor whom we trust, who would help us, you know, because sometimes if we're undersensitive, we'll probably get into too much self-care. If we're oversensitive, you're going to get into too much self-sacrifice. So oftentimes you need an outside monitor who can look at your life and say, you know, no, you're doing too much, you're doing too little. Now, I want to talk about sustaining ourselves. So sustaining ourselves for, like I said, if we were in a sprint, when you watch a sprint in the Olympics, you know, it's over in 10 seconds and everybody just goes full out. When you watch a marathon, nobody goes full out. They got to pace themselves for 2 hours. Well, if like Jesus, if we were going to die in 3 years, you don't have to pace yourself much. If you're going to minister for 40 years, you got to pace yourself and so on. So I want to look at some rules for this, but I want to begin with a story. I say it's a mythical story. I say it's an ego drama and a theodrama. You know, theo is the word for God. In our ministry, we're constantly involved in both an ego drama and in a God drama. And this is the story. Now, I draw the story from the Sufi mystics, you know, and it's a story they use in their formation programs, you know, when they're training a Sufi spiritual director. And this is the story. Okay. They say, once upon a time, said there was a young man, and this young man felt God's call. He felt God's call to preach God's consolation and to preach God's challenge to the world. So this young man went and he apprenticed himself to the elders in the deep woods. And the elders trained him, they instructed him, and when they felt he was ready, they gathered around this young man, they laid their hands on him, they blessed him, and they sent him out with their blessing. Said, go out, you're blessed by us, and go and preach God's consolation and God's challenge to the world. So this young man, full of passion, full of faith, set out, and this is the way he would do it. Each day, he would go to a village or a town, and he'd go into the market square just at high noon, when people were buying and selling and drinking ouzo and tea, and the kids were skipping and playing in the market squares, and he would shout out. He would say, is there anyone here who wants to hear about God's challenge and God's consolation? And always there would be. Always there would be one elder would say, I will hear it. And he would take the young man, to his house. And then that night after the supper meal, some people would gather, but not many people. And some people would come late. Some people would leave early. They would listen to him in polite boredom. And after he was finished, they would engage him in a couple of, polite questions, and he would leave. And always he left discouraged. He would go back to his meager lodgings, and he would think, this is not the people that God has sent me to preach to. And so it went on. Every day he'd go into a village and say, does somebody want to hear about God's consolation and challenge? And every day some elder would take him to the house, and it would be the same as the night before. A few people would gather. Some would come late. Some would leave early. There'd be polite questions, and he'd leave. And so it went on until one day. One day he came to a large town, and he went into the market square at high noon, just as every day before, and he says, does anyone want to hear about God's consolation and God's challenge? And one of the elders said, we will hear you. And he took him to his house. And that night was very different. They had set up a platform in the market squares. And that night a crowd gathered, a large, large crowd. And nobody came late, and nobody left early. And they didn't listen in boredom, they listened with rapture as he spoke for some hours. And then they engaged him in some very deep questions, and he filled with energy. And that night when he went back to his lodge, he said, finally, I found the people that God has sent me to preach to. And all the next day he was full of energy. And he was working on what he would say that night to the people. And after the supper meal, he went to the town square. And it was like the night before. The chairs were set up. There was a platform. And as he went up to speak, the elder took by the sleeve and said, no, it's not you tonight. This woman is going to give a talk here tonight. And he sat down and he listened politely to this woman as she spoke. And it was like the night before. The people engaged and they asked her deep questions late into the night. And he went back to his lodgings and he felt very empty. And the next morning he got up early to leave the village to continue his journey. And as he gets to the edge of the village, the elder was there, and the elder said, why are you leaving us? We liked listening to you. And the young man said, well, obviously you don't need me. You have other people who can speak to you about God's challenge and God's consolation. The elder took him by the sleeve and he said, young man, let me give you a counsel. Let me give you a counsel. He says, the young man who was so full of himself 2 nights ago and was so empty of himself last night said, neither of those people is you. Stay with us and we'll teach you who you are. And because he was a counselor, he repeated it the second time. He says, the young person was so full of himself 2 nights ago and so empty of himself last night, neither of them is you. Stay with us and we'll teach you who you are. Bring this up because in our struggle with tiredness, with tension, with so on, that young man is inside of us. And we're going to struggle with that. Except, as the elder said, it's not us struggling. You know, when we have success in ministry and people are listening with rapt attention and so on, it fills us naturally with energy. And when things aren't going well, when you're preaching a homily or a sermon on a Sunday, you look around and not anybody's remotely interested in what you're saying and so on. We can just so empty, it becomes so empty and depressed and so on. But as this elder says, neither of those two people is us. That's our ego filling and our ego emptying. So stay with us and we'll teach you who you are. Okay. So I want to give us some commandments for the long haul here. And I have 8 of them. And so let me start with the first one. The first one, accept tension and opposition as part of your ministry. Accept tension and opposition as part of your ministry. Remember, and Jesus is pretty clear about that. Jesus said, if you're going to be my follower, they're going to treat you the way they treated me. And notice they didn't just treat Jesus with tension. Jesus had some wonderful successes. At times people, flocked to him. And, remember that wonderful text in Mark where Mark says when the apostles came back from their first missionary excursion, and Mark said they came back and he said they were full of energy and so on. He said, and then people gathered around them and there were so many people, they didn't have time to eat. Or Jesus would try to get to the other side of the lake, and when he got there, they were all there, and so on. So he had some wonderful successes. which we will have. But also there's going to be constant, there's going to be tension, there's going to be opposition, and we need to accept that as part of our ministry. You know, when I was provincial of our order in Western Canada, and it was just a time when we started having a shortage of priests. And so there was this nun, marvelous woman. And so I put her in charge of a rural parish. You know, I said, you know, you act as the pastor and so on. And you know, we'll have a priest come out once in a while for the Eucharist and so on. So she did. And actually, it went very, very well. But she came to see me, said, you know, some people don't like me and some people don't accept me and so on. Well, I knew a lot of the people there. She probably had 90% of the people who loved and accepted her. 10% didn't. I said, sister, those are really good numbers. She said, nobody gets better than that. You know, I said, 9 out of 10 people love you. 9 out of 10 people think you're wonderful. 1 out of 10 doesn't. But that goes with the ministry. You're never going to have 10 out of 10. Jesus didn't have 10 out of 10. Oftentimes, Jesus didn't have 9 out of 10. And so to know that this is part and parcel of ministry. Then second, be gentle with yourself and your inadequacies. Be gentle with yourself and your inadequacies. That banner I told you about during the discussion, you know, with the sister had on a banner, she says, fear not, you are inadequate. You know, it's interesting, forgiveness is hard. We all struggle to forgive others. But interestingly, the person we struggle the most to forgive is ourselves. And again, particularly if you're a sensitive person. Henry Nouwen used to say, he says, every night, he said, I spend long hours and I try to do everything. It's my day is just jammed full of everything. He said, when I go to bed at night, he said, I'm always conscious of what I didn't do. There's somebody else you're supposed to have visited. There's somebody else you should have written. There's somebody else you should have phoned. You should have stayed a little longer with this other person. There's the street person you walked. There's a meeting you avoided, some webinar you should have done, and so on. We're always conscious of our inadequacies, and but we have to be able to let them go. You know, there's I'm sure it's mythology, but it's a good one. But they say John the 23rd, in this marvelous Pope, you know, who gave us the Vatican Council. They said when he'd go to bed at night, he'd always, his last prayer was this, Lord, he said, it's your world. I'm taking a sleep. You take over. And I think every pastor needs that. You know, say, you know, Lord, it's your world. And you know, but there's something to it. It's still God's world. God is still in charge. We are ultimately dispensable. But we have to forgive ourselves for not being God. Then, be doubly gentle with those you minister to in their inadequacies. This is so important. You know, we're beset by weaknesses. Remember the text I gave you from Hebrews, and it says, he or she, the minister can be gentle with others because he or she is beset by weakness. You know, the great gift of our own weakness is that hopefully it will let us understand, be empathic with the weakness and inadequacies of others. You know, that's the great gift of our weakness, that it can make us be true, compassionate ministers, you know, and so that be gentle with your own weakness, but to be doubly gentle with those you minister to in their weakness. Unlike, remember that the famous story in Scripture on forgiveness, where the master forgives the debt of his servant, a large debt, and 10 minutes later, this servant is throttling a servant who owed him a lot less, you know. See, because we're weak, we need to be gentle with others' weakness. Tell you a little story here. When I was ordained, as a Roman Catholic priest in Edmonton in 1972. In those years, there was still something, we still had an exam called jurisdiction. And so you were ordained as a Catholic priest and you could do everything except hear confessions. You weren't allowed to hear confessions until the bishop gave you, a specialized permission to hear confession. And you had to do an exam called jurisdiction. And the bishop could have administered it himself, but he didn't have time. So he'd farm it out usually to the moral theologians at the seminary. And so they would give you mock confessions. Somebody comes in, I had an abortion, what do you do this, and so on, and how would you handle this? And so I had 3 of these, examinations from moral theologians about how I would handle different situations in confession. And so when I got called in by the head moral theologian and rector of the seminary, he told me, he said, we're going to recommend to the bishop to give you jurisdiction, but we're doing it with hesitation. We're doing it with hesitation. He said, we feel you're going to be too soft on people, that you're going to be too gentle and you're not going to be, and then he said, always remember this, Father. He says, the truth sets people free. He said, and you don't do people a favor by being too gentle with them. So I got an asterisk, but I got jurisdiction to hear confession. Well, 6 months later, I was in California working in doing a graduate degree. And I was staying at one of our parishes in Los Angeles, a large parish and so on. And there was an old priest there, retired. He was in his 70s, and I shouldn't say old anymore, I'm in my 70s and so on. And he was blind, but he's one of these great gentlemen that I've met. And so one night I was alone with him. We were sitting in the lounge of the rectory. And I said to him, Leo, his name was Leo, I said, Leo, if you had your priesthood to do over again, would you do it differently? And he said, yes, I would. Yes, I would. He said, if I had my priesthood to do over again, he said, I would be much more gentle next time. He said, in the seminary, they always said, the truth sets you free. Don't be gentle with people. And he says, I believed, he said, and it was a mistake. He said, people have so many burdens. They have so many burdens. He said, we need to lift their burdens, not to double their burdens. I learned a lesson there. Be doubly gentle. Then number 4, lean on grace and not just on willpower. What is grace and what is willpower? Let me give you an example. And it's the contrast that the Bible or the Gospels themselves set up between Jesus and John the Baptist. Okay? They come to John the Baptist and say, are you the Christ? And the Baptist said, no. He said, I'm not the Christ. He said, in fact, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandal straps. But then he says this. He said, I come and I baptize with water, but he baptizes with fire and the Holy Spirit. I baptize with water, he baptizes with fire and the Holy Spirit. What's the difference between fire and water? Okay. Water is this. Water can wash things clean, but it can't change anything. Okay? Imagine you're walking on a beach and you find an old lamp buried in the sand, and you take it home and you power wash it. You just power all the sand out of it. Now it's perfectly clean. You see what you got, but you haven't changed it. But fire is alchemy. Fire can melt that lantern down and change it into something else. So let's go back to John the Baptist and Jesus. John is telling the people this is, the difference between me and Jesus, I can tell you what's wrong with you, but I can't change anything. See, remember, John the Baptist calls people to their sins, but that's only half there. He said, I can tell you what's wrong with you, but I can't change your life. Says, Jesus can not only tell you what's wrong with you, he's fire. The fire can change your life. See, that's the difference between willpower and grace. If any of you have ever been involved with 12-step programs, they're predicated on this. But before we get to 12-step programs, let's deal with Jesus. You know, when Jesus, right after that incident of the rich young man, and he walks away sad, and the text said, then Jesus turns to the disciples and says, I tell you truly, it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Then Peter says, if that's the case, it's impossible. And Jesus said, in fact, it is. It's impossible for human beings. It's not impossible for God. See, every addict knows it's impossible to stop drinking on your own, but it's possible to do it with a higher power. You know, that's the difference between living our life by grace or living our life by willpower. And again, if you're a strong person who hasn't made a lot of mistakes in your life, that's wonderful. But then the danger is we think we can do it. I can actualize myself and do this. At a certain point we can't. Or if we can, sometimes we can, but then we end up like the older brother of the prodigal son. I've done everything right, and yet there's a bitterness inside of me because I'm acting out of willpower, not out of grace. I want to double back on this. I want to do the number 6, what I call praying effectively, to learn how to pray effectively. And then I want to turn that to grace. I want to enter that through the Gospel of John. As you know, the Gospel of John, let me just take a little drink of water here, sorry. As you know, the Gospel of John is very different than the other 3 Gospels. You know, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they give a kind of a chronology, Jesus, you know, there's a beginning, there's an end, and so on. But also, this is what's important. In the Synoptic Gospels, they write up Jesus from the point of view of his humanity. So Jesus is a human, he's divine and human, but they emphasize his humanity. He walks the earth as a man who happens to be God, okay? John's Gospel is different. John's Gospel was written much later, and in John's Gospel, Jesus has no humanity whatsoever. He is God from the first line to the end. Remember that it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So in John's Gospel, Jesus is God walking around in human flesh, and to the smallest detail. So for instance, John says, Philip asked him, how many loaves and fish do you have? And Jesus says, Jesus asked him, how many loaves and fish do you have? John said in brackets, he already knew, you know, God doesn't have to ask us any questions. Okay. Or like in John's Gospel, when they come to arrest Jesus in the garden, he stands up, everybody falls over. Okay. Now, but it begins this way. These are going to be the first words out of Jesus' mouth in John's Gospel. So he's God. And the people are looking at him, the disciples of John, and they're looking at him out of curiosity. And he says to them, what are you looking for? Just that question. What are you looking for? And the whole gospel is to answer that question. Jesus is going to explain. We're looking for the way, the truth, the life, the water of life that we drink and never have to be thirsty again. We're looking to be born again. You know, all those motifs in John. We're looking to have our eyes open so we see more deeply, you know. So the whole Gospel of John is to answer that question, what are we looking for? But the original ending of John's Gospel was this. Chapter 20 was written later. It ended with Jesus at the tomb, Mary Magdalene at the tomb on Easter Sunday in the morning. And Jesus meets her. She thinks it's the gardener. And he says to her, what are you looking for? And she thinks he's the gardener. He says, well, I'm looking for the body of Jesus. Then Jesus answers the entire gospel with one word, Mary. He pronounces her name in love. She fell at his feet, which means she became his disciple. That's what disciples do. Okay. He pronounced her name in love effectively. Now, that's the entire Gospel of John, you know, and it's a gospel that incidentally the church didn't accept for a long time, the other churches, because In John's gospel, there are no rules. There's only one rule: to have an intimate relationship with Jesus. Okay. I'll tease that out in another example. Some years ago, and I'd already been ordained priest for 25 years, and I went on a retreat. French-Canadian retreat director, Robert Michel, gentle old man, and he had a wonderful retreat. And he began to retreat this way. He says, well, he said, you've all been in this business for a long time, and you know how to pray. He said, but I want to teach you this week how to pray in a special way. I want to teach you how to pray in such a way that maybe not this week, or maybe not even this year, but sometime in your prayer life, you can open yourself so you can hear God say to you, I love you. Because before that, your life will never be right. You'll be searching for this, you'll be searching for that. And you need to hear God pronounce your name in love. Okay. Incidentally, you know who gets this right? Our evangelical brothers and sisters. This is the evangelical religion. It's the Gospel of John. You know, see, have you met Jesus Christ? Have you been born again? Have you had that effective moment? Now, sometimes in the other churches, we don't emphasize that enough. And then we tend to act, excuse me, we tend to act out of willpower and not grace. You know, the grace of being loved and knowing we're loved. And the danger is when we're living our lives out of willpower, doing our ministry out of willpower, we end up doing it like the older brother, the prodigal son. We'll say, I've always been faithful, I've always done it right, and now I'm bitter, I'm angry, I can't go in the house. Notice the house there is God. The Father is trying to get him to come into the house to celebrate. He's outside the house of heaven through bitterness, even though he's done everything right. That's the danger. You know, I'm a Roman Catholic, and for us particularly, because in our theology, we've always emphasized willpower. We have always we've been very Pelagian or semi-Pelagian. You know, you can do this, you can do this. You know, part of the Reformation with Luther was precisely Luther on this. You can't do it by willpower. You got to do it by grace. So one of the essences of Protestantism, and it's particularly of evangelicals and so on, is this: the grace. You can't do this by willpower. We have to live by grace. And but anyway, I want to end with this to leave some time here. Or maybe I'll do one more afterwards. But I want to really emphasize this: for us, all the tensions that we struggle with, we need ordinary human things to combat those tensions. You know, we need, you know, proper recreation. You might need a good glass of wine at night. You might be so on. But also we need effective support from our families and loved ones, but we also need at a certain point to be known that we're loved by God effectively, not just effectively, affectively, that somehow we're drawing power out of that. Let me do one more, and then we'll and it's my last one. It said, stay until the end. Stay until the end. You know, the word faithful and the word full of faith are the same words. To be full of faith is to be faithful. And Jesus says, the person who perseveres to the end will be saved. I'll tell you a story on this. I have an older brother who is retired now, still alive, but he had been a missionary for many years in northern Canada with two different tribes, the Dene peoples and the Chippewa people, and the Cree people. Dene are the Chippewas. Okay. But he tells this story. He said when he first got there, and he had 3 large villages he was serving, and he said during his first year, he had this curious experience that every time he made an appointment with somebody, they broke it. He said people would be really nice to say, yeah, we'll drop in at 7 o'clock. They wouldn't show. Or say, yeah, come to the house at 7:30. He'd go there, be nobody home. So after a while, he realized this is a pattern. This is not episodic and accidental. So he went to see an elder. He said to the elder, he said, you know, every time I make an appointment, they break it. And the elder burst out laughing. He said, of course they're going to break it. He said, the last thing they need right now is to have a white man organize their lives for them. Of course they're going to break it. So he said, what should I do? And the elder said, well, very practically, just don't make an appointment. Just show up. They'll be nice to you. But then he said this. He said, I'll tell you what you should do. He said, stay here a long time, and then they'll trust you and keep their appointments. He said, stay here a long time, and then they'll trust you. He said, they're testing you right now. They want to find out whether you're a missionary or a tourist. They're testing you. They want to see whether you're a missionary or whether you're a tourist. He said, they've been betrayed by everybody. Why should they trust you? But notice, trusted, stay a long time. And he said every year he stayed, there was more trust. Every year he stayed, people kept appointments and so on. See, that's what it means to be faithful. It means to stay. It doesn't mean you have to stay in a parish forever or whatever. I think we all know what the word fidelity means, that we just don't move away. And in the fidelity, it means sometimes we're going to be tired. Sometimes we're going to be angry. Sometimes we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes people want to try to kill us. Sometimes you might want to kill some of your parishioners. It doesn't matter. You stay till the end, and then it'll all wash wonderfully clean. I leave you with this, and we have about 20 minutes left here for questions, so I turn it back to John Mark.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Renjy,
yeah, thank you, Father Ron. I think John Mark's Wi-Fi crashed, so he's trying to jump on right now.
Okay, well, you're flying solo then.
Yeah, I was following along, and I was trying to pay close attention to this, but did you speak to carry your solitude as a high level? You might have jumped over that one.
I knew I had too much stuff, so I jumped over it. You want me to comment?
I would love, that was one of the ones as I was reading the list that I was hoping that you would speak to. Would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, okay, I'll speak to it from two angles. First from literature or life, and then from the Gospels. There's a Czech writer called Ivan Klima. Okay, Ivan Klima. And he wrote a book when he was still a young man, although this book is now, I actually quote the book in the Holy Longing, but he wrote a book, and it's called My First Loves, okay? And it's autobiographical. So he's a young writer in Czechoslovakia in the 90s. And he writes this book, and he talks about how he grew up in the Czech society at the time. And he moved to this culture. He said, we're everybody just bracketed morals. He said, kind of everybody slept with everybody and nobody cared about anything. He said, and he, even though he had no religion, didn't believe in God, he said, he simply didn't. And he said, something inside of me stopped me. And people would say, like Ivan, why did you do this? He said, I don't know. He said, but in my own journals, I'd say, I'm just trying to carry my solitude at a higher level. I just thought it was such a beautiful poetic line. He said, I value myself and I value who I am. I just want to carry my solitude at a higher level. Okay. And, but it's interesting, under the book, he says, when I die, he said, because that's the way I'm going to live. He said, when I die and I face, if there is a God, he said, what's God going to say to me? Is he going to say, Ivan, why did you waste your life? Or is he going to say, Ivan, I'm glad that you carried your solitude at a higher level. Now, scripturally, that is the story of the invitation to the rich young man and the invitation he turns down. Remember, this young man comes to Jesus, and we villainize this young man, and we shouldn't. He's a good young man, Remember, he comes to Jesus and said, what must I do to possess eternal life? And Jesus said, what does Scripture say? Scripture says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I've already been doing that. Notice, this is not somebody asking for first conversion. This is a very good person, okay? And so what am I still lacking? Jesus said, well, then you have to sell everything. In essence, he comes to Jesus and said, Jesus, I've given up almost everything for you. What must I still do? And Jesus says, well, you've answered your own question. The word is everything. What have you held back? I'll give you a one-line homily from the Desert Fathers on this. They said a young abbot went to see a senior abbot, and he says, Father, as I am able with my weakness, I keep the rule, I say all the prayers, I keep the fast, I do everything I possibly can for Jesus. Said, what else should I do? He said, and the older abbot raised his hand, said, and his fingers turned to lamps of fire, and he said, why not become pure flame? It's an image, This guy said, I've done almost what? Become pure flame. That's what Jesus is telling the rich young man. He said, you are a good person. Why not become a great person? Why not just take it, not just one notch higher, take it to the highest notch? Why not roll all the dice? Teresa of Avila had this image for the human soul. It's just, the human soul is like a mansion. Imagine you have a house with 30 rooms, okay? And you've given 27 of those to God, but you've kept 3 because you need them. That's the rich young man said, what the last 3 rooms, and incidentally, scholars will point out he's being called to something higher. And you know why? Because see, normally, remember the text in the gospel where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. He finds a perfect pearl. He sells everything he has and gets the pearl. But notice he gets to see the pearl first. And he rolls the dice. Here, the rich young man, he doesn't get to see what he's going to have. Jesus said, roll all the dice. What do I get? Roll them. And you see, that's the final stage of the spiritual life. In the initial conversion, you kind of see what you're going to get. Here, it's the last stage, and that's the call to a higher solitude, And in fact, that the other thing, Renjy, is also with, catechetically with people, there are so many things where people say, is this a sin? Is it a sin to do this? I say, no, it's not necessarily a sin. It's not a question of sin. It's at what level do you want to live? At what level do you, there's always higher invitations, Since you're all adults and ministers here, let me risk an example. Like sometimes people come to say, is it wrong to masturbate? Is that a sin? I said, well, it's not wrong. At what level do you want to live at? Do you want to carry this tension at a higher level or not? It's not a question of being good or bad. It's a question of, we're always invited to carry more attention, to live at a higher level. Or I love the expression from Klima, to carry your solitude at a higher level. That's just this constant invitation. It's a beautiful poetic expression of that.
I love how I'm glad you took the time to expand on that. I think even as I was listening to you, I grew up in a context where when I saw leadership, decisiveness, authoritative, clear direction, visionary, moving something to another level. And basically it described everything other than Asian in a sense. And when I read through these commandments for the long haul, the idea of gentleness is something that just really speaks and moves to me. I guess, could you speak a little bit more to qualities of our leadership as pastors, as we are moving in this season, so that we can model that for our people?
Yeah, that's such a big question. I don't know where to begin on it, or I'm not even sure I'm the right. See, leadership is such a wide thing that that maybe I'll address it this way. We're each going to have different qualities for it. Leaders have to be firm, they have to be gentle. Leaders have to be visionary, and they have to be down on the ground and so on. And a lot of times we're more one than the other. So if and again, Mark, I'm doing the thing by avoiding the question by not answering it. No, in terms of differences. So if your strength is gentleness, at times you're not going to have the firmness you need. If your strength is firmness, there are times you're not going to have the gentleness you need. If you're a visionary, it's going to be wonderful, but at times you're not going to have your boots on the ground enough. If you have your boots on the ground a lot of times you're not going to be visionary enough, and so on. So that I'll give you an example by teasing out the thing between gentle and and hard enough. You know, I became I was an academic, and you know that's safe enough, and a writer. But in 1990, I was named provincial, which is like kind of a bishop, except you're temporary, for the Oblates in Western Canada. And when you're named that, we were sent to Rome for 3 weeks for what we sarcastically call charm school for years. But one of the things that they taught there, which I found, and now I've been president here for 15 years, and I find that's the single hardest part of my job, and that is to address dysfunction, you know? See, so when you have dysfunctional people, so for instance, imagine you're a bishop or you're a leader and there's somebody's an alcoholic, you know, and you have to put this guy out of ministry and so on, you know, that's hard to do. You know, this guy's a friend and so on, or somebody's acting out sexually or whatever, you know, and we have to confront people, you know. For instance, as a president of school, the singly hardest things I've done has been to fire people. Sometimes people have to be fired. I mean, I need 3 days of getting ready for that, 3 days coming down from it, you know. Now, other people have that strength, but then sometimes they don't have the sensitivity in other areas, you know. See, leadership, Renjy, we can benchmark, say, you have to be firm, you have to be gentle, you have to be visionary, you have to be practical, and you know, you can list all these things. You have to be attentive, and you have to build community. You have to address dysfunction, and you know, those are all ideals, and all of us will be, the boxes won't be checked in the same way. You know, you're going to check some boxes really strongly, and you're going to have those strengths for leadership, and then at other times, you know, you're going to say that this is not. That is why, you know what, it's good. Like right now, I'm lucky because we have a team of executives, vice presidents, so we do this together. So if to fire somebody, it's not just me, it's, you know, it's 5 or 10 people saying, you know, we've come to this decision, here are the reasons, and so on. But a lot of times as a pastor, you don't have that option. You know, it's gonna come down to you. You got to do some hard things, you know. Again, I wish there was an easy answer, but and there are no. I've long since believed that there's a perfect leader somewhere. No, Jesus. But from there, there's a fall down.
No, thank you so much for answering it with the diversity of leadership that we need in the church.
Yeah. Yeah, Father Rolheiser, can I just jump into that? You know, thinking about your first 3 points and what you just said, of course, I come at it with Ruth Barrow's tortured sensitivity that perfectly captures the intricacy of my fragile soul. But I think this question is for wherever people fall in the gentleness to strength kind of personality temperament thing. You know, you mentioned that, or in your first lecture, that none of us come into adulthood without wounds. By the time you're in your 30s, it's not, are you wounded, but how have you been wounded? And that obviously plays a key role in our ministry, but also none of us go through ministry without getting wounded in the present tense, not just in the past by a family of origin, but present tense, you know. And man, I feel that more acute in the last few months than ever before. And I hesitate to do this, but I want to read to you a little quote that I've just been thinking about a lot. So I've been doing a lot of research around the psychological principle of transference and its, you know, its implications for anybody in leadership. So this is Erik Erikson, famous psychologist. I'm sure you've read him. I think you've read your work on developmental psychology. This is his definition. This is from his psychological profile of Gandhi, and it's his definition of transference. Let me just read it to you, and I'd love to get you to riff on it. He writes, transference is a universal tendency active wherever human beings enter into relationship with others in such a way that the other, in this case myself or pastors, also stands for persons as perceived in the pre-adult past, so former parent or pastor or whatever. He thus serves the reenactment of infantile and juvenile wishes and fears, hopes and apprehensions, And this always with a bewildering mixture of effects. That is a ratio of loving and hateful tendencies, which under certain conditions alternate radically. And that's a bit dense. That's the best definition I've ever heard of transference. And I'm living in that reality right now and feeling wounded, you know, as people bring their own woundedness to bear on me, sometimes because I made a mistake and other times just because of people's own stuff. How do you, when you go into that solitude, when you attempt to be gentle, frankly, how do you deal with woundedness? You know, we're dealing with criticism as a regular part of leadership, and making mistakes in public is a regular part of leadership. But especially when you really feel wounded by people that you've served and then attack you or whatever, you know, how do you personally, at a very real emotional level prayer, how do you process that wounding and not let it make you quit or turn you into an angry person or a defensive person, or, you know?
Okay, John Mark, first of all, thanks for linking this to the phenomena of transference. You know, I'm glad you because it helps my address the question. You know, when I look back on my seminary training and all the seminary training I've been involved with, that is the single weakest point. We weren't taught enough about transference, you know. So if I put it in simple terminology, when I was a seminarian, they taught us how to do ministry. They didn't teach us what ministry was going to do to you. So you know, they teach you, this is the way you minister and preach and so on, but they didn't teach you, as this is happening, there's all kinds of transfers and counter-transference happening to you. People are going to fall in love with you, it's not really love, and then they're going to counter-transfer and they're going to hate your guts and so on. And see, so that so often we aren't prepared to not take that personally. See, if we understand it in terms of transference, then you can distance that from your person. You can say that it's not really me that this person's hating right now. You know, you can understand it as part of your ministry. You know, I've seen so many people, clergy, but sometimes psychologists too, and counselors who really got wounded and bruised because, you know, they overread the transference. See, someone is essentially throwing a God image on you. So, John Mark, you're my God, you know. But when they do that, they're going to eventually take you off the pedestal, and they're going to take you off with some vehemence, you know. And then, you know, both were unfair to you. Both, you know, the idealization, and then also the demonization that comes afterwards. You know, people who idealize you are eventually going to demonize you. That's always the flip side of the coin, and so on. Sadly, it doesn't work the other way. That people who demonize you will eventually idolize you. Although sometimes that's true. Sometimes the person who hates your guts the most at a certain point, you become God to them, and so on. But John Mark, it's more to understand that, you know, you take it to prayer, but also take it to, you know, I don't know if you drink alcohol, but maybe sometimes you should just have a drink with somebody, with friends. You know, a lot of times, let me give you a rule of thumb here that comes from psychology. You know, they say as a pastor, for instance, you are asked to carry tension for your people, okay? But now, you may not unload it on them, you know, but you need to download it someplace. That's where you need to have colleagues or whatever. You go out and do some wine drinking, you know, or scotch drinking or something, and there you talk about how you're going to lose it all and shoot all the parishes and stuff, you know. See, so that you need a safe place to unload that tension, you know. But also, I'm glad that you linked it to transference, because transference, it means you weren't responsible for the idealization completely, and you're not responsible for the demonization. And again, in all seminaries, I think that's the greatest weakness in their training. The place where I see it done, if any of you have gone through like CPE training and clinical pastoral training, oftentimes there they tend to address some of this. That, you know, not just we're going to show you how to minister. We're going to teach you about some of the things that feelings are going to happen as you're ministering. Stuff is happening to you. And but find a safe place. Prayer is one of the places, but not, you know, we're incarnational. You need prayer, you also need other people, you know, to share that tension with. And it's real. And if it's happening, Mark, it's a good thing. It means you're ministering. You know, it comes with the territory.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. And, you know, that just kind of gaining our sense of self, you know, in prayer. I'm really grateful. This, yeah, just I think to sum up, just putting all of this into the paradigm of tension is so incredibly helpful. So, Renjy, unless if you have anything else, I think we are officially out of time. We just hit noon. So we'll pass it back to the legend, our local bishop of choice. We call him Bishop, but Kevin Palau. And Father Rolheiser, I just can't say enough thank you on behalf of all of those listening right now and the many hundreds or even more that will listen in the weeks to come to the recording. We're so grateful for the way that you've been a pioneer to the spiritual life, and you've shown us kind of what comes. Last question, and this will be a very short one. So myself and my friends were obsessed with your trilogy that your two books through of Holy Longing into Sacred Fire, and your three paradigm kind of stage theory of life of getting your life together, giving your life away, and giving your death away. When, I'm too young to read it anyway, but when can we expect book 3 in the trilogy? Last question.
Well, I'm going to be finished as president here on September the 8th, and I'm going to start writing on September the 9th. So hopefully by Christmas or January or something, it should be finished. And then usually it takes, with Doubleday, it takes about 8 months or something to a year for it to come out. So I hope to hand in a manuscript before spring. And so.
Praise God. I just need to make sure I have that before I turn 65. So I'm ready for what comes after, you know. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. I got taken up and almost forgot to come back on, and just thank everybody, especially Father Ron, for investing your life into the kingdom and having such words of wisdom. I know we're going to want to share this link with others, and we will get you the recording for sure by tomorrow, and please do pass it along. And the hits keep coming. We have NT Wright here with us July 2nd. That's a week from Thursday. So I know this is a lot of amazing content, and we will get, again, the recordings out. God bless you all, and let's keep ministering together and make Portland a better place. Bless you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Father Ron.